Welcome to Drawing Folds in Charcoal. Here's our drawing reference, the drapery that we're going to be using. To begin, I always like to start with a frame on my sketchbook page that is more or less proportional to whatever it is I'm drawing. You don't have to draw a frame, but it's very helpful for me to make sure that my proportions stay on track as I draw. So I've got a long, skinny rectangle here because our drawing is a long hanging drapery. I'm kicking off with just a B pencil. You could use an HB pencil. I wouldn't suggest anything stronger than a 2B pencil. Hopefully, if you've taken a class with me before, you know that we always want to start with the big shapes and then make our way down to the details. So I'll begin by simply sketching in really lightly and loosely the overall shape of this drapery. And I'm just going to eyeball it at first, and I'll come back a little later to see if my proportions are correct. And what I mean by that is this big, huge shape, sort of the positive space of the drapery. I want to make sure that the height and width are appropriate. So the width got about this wide. If I use the same unit of measurement, swing my pencil down, I can say, okay, in my drawing, this drapery is 1. Then I pull the pencil down to where the last mark left off. It's a little less than 2 widths tall or high. And is that the same as what we see on our reference picture? 1, and then I go down again, 2, and ooh, almost a half. So no, my initial drawing is way off. So what can I do? I'll extend upward. A couple of things I could do to make this even better this time around are to make the drapery slightly thinner than I have it, and to go all the way perhaps to here. Let's try that. 1 and 2 and almost a half. Okay, this is much better. So my proportions are correct. It's so important to take your time with the initial layout here because if we don't get these first proportions incorrectly, it's going to be a lot more difficult to have an accurate drawing by the end of this. Now, of course, these are just folds. It's not like doing a portrait where if you have the nose in the wrong place, it's going to look terrible. It would just look like a slightly different arrangement of drapes. But we're aiming for accuracy, and this is the same approach you should take when you draw absolutely anything. Always measuring and checking your proportions, starting from the big shapes and then moving to the smaller ones. So what are some smaller shapes that we see within this larger image? Well, what really stands out to me is this little pocket in the corner, and I'm looking just at the shape of whatever's inside this little kind of corner area. And if I use my pencil trick again, 1, 2, and a little bit more, the width of this should be 1, 2, and a little bit more, so I think I should make this a little smaller. And now I've got a nice little proportional pocket. And whenever I drew this in, I was really paying attention to the angles that this drapery is making as it goes. Drops downward, dips into what we call kind of a diaper fold here, where it's got this little loop that's gonna stand out, and then curves back up to wrap around the rest of the drapery. So I noticed this shape. Another shape that really stands out to me after this is the large kind of triangular dip that curves in before we get to the drapery that hangs straight down here. So I'm going to, first let's make sure that I've divided this accurately. So first let's see how long this hanging stretch, this little curtain fold here, is compared to the rest of the drawing. So it's much more than half. And if we measure just the top part, it's 1 less than 2. So if I bring this up quite significantly, actually, I'm going to erase this little chunk here. I'm going to end up with 1. It's a little less than 2. So 1. Nope, still way too big. So let's shrink it even more. I have a feeling this probably needs to come up as well. This is not the exciting, intuitive, quick way of drawing, but if you want this to look proportional, it makes all the difference. So I'm gonna go like too far and see 1, yeah, almost 2. Wow, I really had that off. So that's very interesting. Now I've got my proportions more correct here. And I'm gonna go ahead and allow myself to make a contour on the edge of this side of the fold, the drapery. And then this will drop straight down from there before it curves back in. So when I say contour, I'm just really paying attention to the actual outline edge of the drape, the subject, as opposed to just kind of quickly drawing in simple angles to kind of represent generally what I'm looking at or what I'm drawing. Okay, so probably the reason my eyes were trying to tell me that this is bigger than it is because this shape or this curve is so strong and it curves down all the way, let's see, past the midpoint before it hops back up here. About right there. So now I've got 2 major guiding shapes that are really going to help me and be my landmark. So it's important for us to keep in mind as artists which lines we initially make signify what. So you wouldn't necessarily have to start with these particular shapes. I am trying to look for the biggest shapes, the most notable shapes, but maybe for you that would have been this inner curve of the drapery. Whatever it is, make sure you know what your lines are referencing, because when we're drawing something like folds, it's so nebulous of an image, it's almost abstract. So you kind of need to help yourself out, just being very conscientious of what each line represents. So with that in mind, let's just move to this side for the next big edge of this drapery. Inside here it curves down. Pay attention to your angles, just do your best. This value shift is quite strong and it's going to go from dark to lighter, so I'm going to let my pencil lighten up there. This is one big fold, and inside that we have a darker area, another smaller fold. It's going to swoop in here. So I'm kind of just moving from right to left, checking for folds and shapes now. So I see from this highlighted foldy area, there's the dark space. I create a very light shadow here just as a place marker. And then, although there are some shadows, there aren't any harsh lines here, I'll just go ahead and keep this soft for now, maybe do a little bit of smudging. And before we do these smaller folds in the corner, let's go back to our bigger shapes. I'm all about big shapes first, just to be systematic, follow my own rules. The next big shape I see is the larger triangle, kind of diaper fold as we call it, curving in this way. I'm going to check to see where that big triangle begins. It looks like it's just inside of the drapery here. It's going to swoop down, almost directly below this fold here. And then it swoops all the way back up, making a tall, skinny triangle, very close to the other line we had. So I've got another key part of the drawing here. The next big shape I see, we've got the very dark areas on either side of that, but there's a strong fold, this beautiful fold here that comes from this dip down below the base of the drapery, all the way up to tuck underneath this fold we just made. So something like that. Okay, so at this point I've got some of the essential shapes of this drapery in. It's far from detailed or like a perfect drawing, but the key proportions are correct. Oh, you know what? We forgot one last thing. I'm gonna pop back in and just create the triangle I see here. There's a black triangle that influences this little poof and some of the action that's happening over here. Okay, so I kind of just using the same technique, looked for the biggest shape or shadow, and now we've got everything accounted for. All right, so back to our willow charcoal. I'm using a very small piece that I've chopped off so that I can use the broad edges of it, but I've also got a nice sharp tip in one area for smaller details. So now I want to come in and do a tonal drawing, looking for lights and darks, and this willow charcoal is really going to be better for the brighter areas. So remember, since it's charcoal, we want to work left to right. So I'm going to start the top corner to the left, just starting to establish where I see some of the darker shadows, or just any shadows at all right now. Anywhere that I put this willow charcoal is going to come off very easily. So this will be more helpful for the lighter areas that are going to end up having just a tiny bit of value to them. So as an example, even if I go pretty dark here, if I come back and smudge it, I'll end up with a very light value or tone. It's also nice about the willow charcoal is it's so erasable that it's easy for me to make any changes right now in case there's something I draw that I don't like. So that's why I like beginning a drawing like this with willow charcoal. Still very flexible. We're not married to any of the lines we're making, but just hunting for those values. Okay, so I notice we have, again, just hunting down those lights and darks, a dark line curving around here. And what's interesting is, although this comes off as a darker shadow, this side of the fold or the drapery is not a dark line, but it's actually more highlighted. So I don't want to go in and make a line there just because I'm used to making lines. Instead, I can leave that for now and allow the white to pop out later because everything next to it is going to be slightly grayer. So I used just a tiny bit of finger smudging, if you look very closely here, in order to get this to the next darkest shadow of value. So it's not the pure white on this side of the drawing. Okay, smudging my fingers off a little bit. Continuing on, moving from left to right. Got a lot of highlights here, but I'm gonna just smudge a little bit where I see some kind of half tones. Halftones are generally where you see those mid-range values where the object seems to be pushed away from you almost. And I'm very systematically trying to look at each shadow and how it connects to the one next to it. So now I'm getting over to this dark shadow right next to our big swoop. So let's go ahead and be bold. I'm gonna press down dark. I'll press down, creating a darker shadow. And then just underneath this, we do see a little bit of a line. It goes right underneath that darker shadow. They don't touch. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? But these are the slight differences that help you see, or that help you create a texture of drapery. In a lot of ways, it's like putting a puzzle together. You know, sometimes the teeniest, tiniest little difference in tone or shadow will be the difference between a puzzle piece fitting or not, kind of creating our own puzzle here. Okay, so got this dark shadow. It kind of lightens up underneath. And these really are all kind of in halftones. I can come back and highlight later. So because we're using charcoal anywhere that's really bright, I can come back and create a better bright value with erasing at the end. Let's go back to this part of the drapery. I see a tiny little dark shadow here, and then this triangle is going to swoop down. I hope you see this triangle. It's a soft edge. So when I say edges, we're looking at the difference between a hard line next to a softer area. So if I have a little rectangle here, this is a hard-edged rectangle. If I was to smudge around the edges of it, the smudged area is very softly shifting into the lighter values. That's called a soft edge. Hard edge, soft edge. That's the difference. And this triangle here is a softer edge. Swoop that back around here. Okay, that'll do it. It really kind of blends out, and I'll do more of the finer details in a bit. I want to capture that this comes around like that. Okay. Still wanting to go from left to right, instead of finishing up here, I'm going to pop down onto this side of the drapery to create the hard edge. We definitely see a hard edge between this dark shadow and the rest of the drapery that's overlapping it. But if I come straight down from here, it'll create that nice buckle in the fabric that we see. It is softer edged over here. Just blend that out. And I'll soften this a little bit with either, you can use your finger or a blending stick. Soften that edge just a bit. These column folds, as they're sometimes called, are nice and easy. You just need that soft gradation in value from darker to medium to light. And as you can see, it's already looking nice and three-dimensional. There we go. From here, sorry, I'll miss out on that part. You got the idea though. Let's continue left to right, systematically creating our shadows. So I'm going to pop here where I see kind of a middle ranged value shadow shape. And oh, look at this interesting kind of cone here. That's beautiful. First, let me get this more abstract shape before I get to that kind of cone thing. Smudge, 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 smudge. See a slightly darker dip right in here, just under here. Now, I'm going to be sensitive to leaving a highlight here. Might even bring that out just a little bit more. Can erase even some of those pencil lines now that I'm wanting that highlight to be there. And a darker line appears just right here. Goes from there very thin, and we see another beautiful triangle swooping all the way down here. Look at that. It's going to curve in around this little area. We've got a dark shadow right there. Okay, getting there, getting there. This will be much more blended out. Do almost the same thing we did with the columns sketch. And at this point, I'm really not worried about making these very accurate. I'm kind of just doing placeholders for these shadow shapes, also to help me know where I am in our move from left to right. I'm so in love with this tiny little cone you see here. If you've ever taken the time to do a cone, you know there's this dark shadow that blends out very gradually. We have a tiny bit of reflected light in the tip here. I hope you see that. And then a dark shadow before we hit this fold in the drapery. Beautiful. Gotta say, as much of a puzzle as these can be, when they start to fit together, it's very satisfying. To kind of set that a little bit, I'm just gonna smudge. And I definitely want to use my blender for this finer blending and soften out a little bit there. Emphasize that cone-like shape of the drapery curving up. And there's not really much of a dark shadow or a line here, so I can even steal some pigment from other areas in the drawing to kind of suggest that shadow there. Okay, so continuing left to right with this darker shadow established. Get some of the subtleties of this bend in the fold, and this is very light in this area, high value but important. These really subtle differences make a large impact in the final drawing. And this gets a little complicated, doesn't it? So we've got, moving from top to bottom, this little bend in the shadow area here, softening to very light gradation before we have a highlight of the shadow shape on this side of it. This shadow I'm seeing is actually going to connect all the way up to the edge of this drape. So I'm going to use the flat edge of my charcoal, start with the wide swath, and then because I'm going vertically, it's going to get thinner. And in one mark, I can get mostly the shadow I want. And there's kind of a break in the shadow between dark and lighter on this edge. Boom. Okay, that more or less captures that. And this darker edge of the side of this drapery comes in here. More soft edge there. It really is quite soft here. You don't want to get too dark because the real darkness happens. Let's see, this kind of folds in as a dark thing. So the real dark shadow comes in, dropping from here onto the side. We're going to see a much harder edge between that mid-range value and the darkest dark in the drapery. Boom, that really starts to make things look three-dimensional, doesn't it? So I've got that established. And then there's this little wiggle here. Be subtle with that and allow it to do its thing. That's where this dark shadow is born. And it's pretty big, isn't it? So let's increase the size over here. It gets wider before it gets skinny again. We've got this shadow here, beautiful gradation on this side of the end of the drapery. And voila! We pretty much got it. Or at least the overall tonal study of the drapery. Now, you could stop here if you're feeling satisfied, but although this has got the overall lights and darks in, I feel like we're missing a couple of things. First of all, maybe a little bit of context around this drapery, so I do want to come back in and show that it's hanging on something later. And even more importantly, with charcoal, we have such a beautiful ability to go very dark. We want to get the serious charcoals out. So what I'm going to do is just kind of soften some of my shadows and also allow a little bit of finger printing to put just the tiniest bit of value in the areas that are lighter, because I want the bright highlights to be even brighter. And to do that, it's all relative, so I can make my darker areas darker, or my medium areas darker, I should say. And then when I come back in, I can erase highlights and they'll really pop. So for example, I've just kind of shadowed all of this up. I see a bright highlight. Oh, let's reestablish one of the brighter highlights here in the top of the fold. And you can see how it looks much brighter. And the area around it that's even just a little bit less shady. Somehow I've lost some of this definition too, so it's another good reason to come back and keep playing with your details. Okay, phase one complete. Let's move on to the compressed charcoal. Compressed charcoal is going to be a lot more intense of a dark. This might be a good moment to wipe off those fingers. All right, so switching to a compressed charcoal. Notice that I've got a sharper tip in one area. I've got the flat edges of the base or the sides that we could use. So again, from left to right, this is going to be a lot trickier because the side of my hand could very easily come in and smudge my drawing. So if you don't want that to happen, just be very aware of where you're drawing, or you could use something even like your smudge stick to rest your hand on, something that won't mess with the page. Actually, I'll use that, it's very comfortable. And let's see, where do I see darker shadows? Definitely, again, left to right. And this is not going to be as erasable, so we're in it this time. Darker shadow here. Very beautiful dark shadow here, this triangle. And just think of them as shapes. We're going again over our original drawing, so if you realize as you're going back through that you made any mistakes, this is the time to fix them. Very thin line here. I see a darker shadow curving in the top here and wrapping up all the way at the top. There's this kind of pocket that swoops in next to another dark shadow. Look how much darker that dark is. It's pretty incredible. Two different types of charcoal, two different looks. And while I'm in this top corner, let's just go ahead and really get it to our liking. I noticed that I've eliminated a highlight that's really over here. It's a little too bright, and my corner was sticking out too much. I can smudge this out a little bit or use my tortillon. Use a little piece of fabric or something else as well. And let's pull this highlight out. If you can see how that's starting to brighten up this area and make it look like it's pushing out toward us. Just a little bit here. Just soften together and looks much better. More like our reference. Forgive the background noises if you can hear people celebrating the art studio I'm at here in San Miguel de Allende is right next to a little cafe, so hopefully if you're like me, these little noises just give a nice ambiance and help you stay focused. So I'm gonna allow those to smooth out, and whenever I work with the tortillon like this, I'm trying to eliminate the tiny little spots of white that you can see through the charcoal. Those, just by being smudged in, can be filled in by the charcoal dust, and it creates a darker effect or a darker value. So now that I've got these established, I can come back in, pull this out. So harder edge there. Okay. Continuing on with our left to right exploration of all these shadows. Kind of just lightly sketching in. Notice how I'm holding this very loosely, like from afar. This is creating just the very lightest amount of pressure because this charcoal is so strong, I don't want to overdo it. Some kind of mess like that before we dip into this very dark shadow here, triangle, which actually I had a highlight between this. It just needs to all be darker. There we go. And then much darker here. So yeah, it's easy to get lost in your own drawings sometimes. Often I'll look for patterns. So highlight, medium tone, darker value. What I noticed was I had a highlight, a medium tone, a highlight, and a dark. Didn't want that, so I had to fix it. Now we're talking. I can just let this smudge on over. And this pulls in a little bit. Anywhere where things seem like they're folding in is going to be a little darker. Those shadow areas. We're thinking in a way like sculptors, you know? Thinking about pushing or pulling the art to create depth. Well, I want to go back. I created some midtones here, but I think if I bring the highlights back in with an eraser, it'll look much better. But first I'm going to establish this darker dark. Since I started it, I've got to finish it. And now I've got that beautiful dark triangle here. And that darker shadow curves underneath this little bump in the fold here. And then pulls out that way. Beautiful. Check to see, okay, well, I see this hard edge, a hard edge, and suddenly soft and nothing. So I'm going to use my finger this time to kind of allow that to smudge out. Maintaining this highlight here. And while I've got my eraser out, I want to pull out this little forward area, or it's a plane that is kind of angling out and capturing some light, is what this part of the fold is before it curves in. And as you can see, I'm just squeezing my little kneaded eraser to create almost like a pencil point. And then I can come in and use it the same way I would a pencil. So we're getting really subtle with the tones in this corner area. Very subtle. And I see a teeny tiny line, which actually, if I had it on hand, I would use a charcoal pencil. I'll have to hunt that down later. Who knows where it is in the studio. But there's a very fine line here. There we go. Now we're talking. Okay, that's looking better. Definitely want to clean this mess up over here. Smooth it out a little bit. So the smoothing out or the blending here is also helping to create that texture of fabric as opposed to something more rough like a brick. I'm not going to play too much with the texture tonight. Really just want to think about values and doing a tonal study, but gosh, you can do beautiful things with the charcoals to create all kinds of different textures. Moving right along, I did notice just a subtle bit more shadow right here. Kind of just going back and checking our work, seeing where we put our shadows where they're needed. And that's darker, and this is going to curve up to just a subtle, but still very present shadow here, pressing very lightly, and then I'm going to come back and blend this all out. Hope it wasn't too streaky with this, but I don't want these lines to really show. And I can use a wider edge of the tortillon to try and blend it out better. And I can even come back and erase the stripy lines that I made and see if that'll help smooth this shadow out a little bit. That'll do the trick. Good enough for me for today. Okay, back with our compressed charcoal. Where's our next deep dark line? Oh, this is bothering me. This is supposed to be a very thin little triangle up here. Okay, that's better. And continuing with our left to right exploration, let's scooch on down. And from afar, you can see how this dark pencil is really making it come to life. Also, when I look from afar, I can see some of the subtle differences in my drawing from the reference. Okay, so left to right, let's go ahead and give this a beautiful, dark, bold value, aka tone. I just want you to hear these artistic vocabulary words over and over again until you're using them like a pro. Value, the quality of lightness or darkness, tone, same exact thing. Just another word, it's a synonym. Okay, that's gonna fold around there. Smooth that beauty out. And allow this to be just a little more soft of an edge on the side. If my finger was too broad, I can come back and pull that highlight out with my eraser. There we go. And I just want to know this is gonna end here. I'm gonna come back and redefine that edge a little later, our background or outline. But I just love how that dark black immediately pushed that fold into the depths. It's giving us some beautiful three-dimensionality. Shadow, shadow, shadow in here. Kind of buffing up, looking to see where do I really need these dark darks in order to get a likeness. Puzzling through one piece after the other. As I'm blending this, you're probably seeing that the original willow charcoal is almost disappearing, but what's so great about it is it allows for those very high values to still show. Okay, that'll do it for our little cone dude. Oh, getting too dark over here. Let's run away before I mess anything up. Coming down to this beautiful dark triangle. It's very dark. Swoopity swoop. And I got that triangular little highlight that occurs before we swoop down here. For this base value, this kind of comes out here. All right. Blend, blend. Such satisfying values. Again, if you don't like the feel of the paper and the charcoal, you could even use gloves or all kinds of different tools. Kind of cleaning my fingers as I go. And awareness is key. It's as if you know that you've got charcoal in your fingers, that can be super helpful if you're trying to create a higher value. So if I was just smudging my fingers over here, I'm getting the very light values that sometimes you need. But if I want to pull charcoal away, I would need to make sure my fingers are really clean. So I want to add just a little bit more of a mid-tone to this background shadow there, because when I come back in with the eraser, as you can see, I can get a beautiful, sharp edge, pulling down to that shadow or area. And it is darker down at the base. Let's find how it was. Okay, awesome. Back to the compressed charcoal. Moving from left to right, since I'm right-handed, and if I didn't mention it, if you're left-handed, you'd be doing the opposite. Okay, so I'm going to come back all the way up here for this drop in the drapery. And this is connected to this cone area, which got a little messy. Feeling good about that. Although I noticed that we need a little bit more of a gradation on this side. Okay, let's blend that out. Fabulous. Okay, now we're getting some of the subtlety and just that very, slight difference in the values here that give it that, again, texture of fabric. A little too textured there maybe, but it will. Blend this out a little bit. It's a sharp edge inside itself, so I think that looks good. I'm gonna leave it there. And what else do we see? Okay, this area is pretty weird, isn't it? That's strange. So we've got our little cone. Actually, I probably should have made the cone bigger. That's probably one of my issues, looking at the reference photo. But that's okay. It's good enough. Got this nice darker area here. I'm just gonna pump up the value a little bit more there. I think that really adds a lot to this looking like fabric. And a little bit more there. Good enough. This actually drops down lower, doesn't it? So this becomes a little bit of a triangle. And this is going to be medium value with a light triangle hiding out behind it. Okay, that's better. So I noticed we've got the darker edge of this side of this triangle, and then it gets lighter, but my mistake was I had it, I think, too bright. We wanted a medium tone here so that we could have a difference between the very brightest value in this tiny little pocket of the folds. So again, it's just a puzzle of values. There we go. It's a little darker under there. There's a tiny little highlight wiggle underneath this area. Let me zoom in so you can see that even better. Here's what mine is looking like so far. And the darkest value, I'm going to swing around here. It goes from the side of this triangle swoops out a bit and then comes all the way up. So this is our big dark shadow. Let's go ahead and very wide comparatively. And it ends up here. Sounds like a party out there. Okay, so by smoothing that out with the finger, you can see how much more intense the dark became. I realized I forgot this little corner up here. We had just one little dark kind of fold before it dips back into the darkest part of that drapery. That's all right. And I'm just gonna get this all in medium tone with my fingers since it's a wider area. And then it's easier for me to come back with a tiny little bit of eraser to define the highlights inside of that. Because there is a little, what I call reflected light shadow on the inside here. With the kneaded eraser and charcoal, you often have to keep moving it because the charcoal comes off in the eraser, and that will stop erasing after a little bit. Okay, that's cool. And there's another brighter highlight on this side also, on the opposite side of that. Keeping careful, again, not to get the side of my hands all smudgy and ruin my drawing. We're almost done. So we've got this established. The last thing to do is maybe some of the subtleties of the base of this fold. It gets just a little darker right here. And then it's kind of a triangular dip. I think that's better. Okay. So on the edge of the far left side of our drapery here, we go from a highlight, that really hard edge, intense difference in value between darkest dark and lightest light, between the black and the white here, and then it'll get darker on the other side. There we go. So I'm just gonna squint and check to see how I feel about this. So far, like a very subtle little shadow right there that I don't have. But for what it is, I'm very pleased. I think I should establish that some of these other very dark values are as dark as this one. So I'm going to come back with even more pressure, more graphite, intensify these values. And the question you're asking yourself is, where are my darkest darks? Where are my brightest highlights? Okay. That's the darkest dark, that's the darkest dark, that's the darkest dark. Sounds like I'm writing a song. That's the darkest dark. Okay. This is a very dark dark. And here. I mess up my shape. I'm losing some control of the tip of my charcoal. You've always got to be careful about that. Soften up that little shape right there. More triangular. And voila! The inside of this complex fold drapery is complete. Now, we're not done yet, because if you'll notice, we've got some edges on the outside of here that just look a little unfinished. I'm not crazy about it. And our entire image will really pop if we have a darker background. So, with that in mind, I'm going to come in with a willow charcoal, and I'm going to make everything around this a different value. Let's see, instead of completely black, although you could go completely black in the background, I'm going to go just for a dark medium value. So I'm pressing down using the whole edge of my willow charcoal to define the edges there. And you can see how that makes that side of the drapery really pop out already. I kind of like the idea of the drapery hanging out from underneath the bottom of my little frame. So I'm going to keep that there. But let's do the same thing on the other side. And remember, you don't have to move. You can move your sketchbook. Makes life a lot easier. Since this is a smaller area, I'm going to use the smaller willow charcoal. Define this area here. Boom. And it's easier for me to make this mark upside down. So I have a pencil line that shows where this edge is, so that's what I'm following. And there's a pencil guide kind of over here as well. This is such a satisfying part of the drawing. It all starts to come together. And the top. And this is a bit more contoured. It's not all totally flat, but it's got little bumps in the area. And sometimes these are following the light right along with, or they're the same value, sometimes they're not. It's all good. Okay. Get this a little more smoothed. And it's complete. Here we have our finished charcoal drapery. Before you close that sketchbook, fixative. So this is a Mexican brand, but it's a fixative that you can buy in all kinds of different varieties. Matte is what I would recommend. Give it a good shake. Hold it about 8 to 12 inches away from your drawing. And give it a nice even application. Whew. Make sure you have some ventilation in the room and your drawing will stick. So I hope yours is satisfying, and more importantly, whether or not you like how it turned out, I hope you understand how to evolve a complex drawing like this, going from big shapes, finding your proportions, being really picky about making sure that you've got the right measurements, the right proportions in the very beginning, and then coming in thinking about your tones, starting with your more medium values and then later intensifying the darkest darks, erasing to bring out your highlights, and sometimes we love that beautiful mid-toned background to really help your image pop. So that is drawing drapery in charcoal. I can't wait to see how yours turned out. Please be sure to post it in the group, and happy drawing!